Hello. Hi, everyone. So I am here basically to prevent Jeremy from having any time to get on stage. So Jeremy is the speaker after me, in case you don't know. So I'm going to talk to you about front-end buzzwords. So just to kind of lay this out, I don't have a ton of time here, and I'm trying to cover like a whole bunch of different concepts and a bunch of different terminology. So I'm going to kind of paint in broad strokes. And if you're like an expert in something that I'm talking about, and you're like, yes, but I agree with you. I get it. But I can't cover all the kind of granular details about every single thing. So it's going to be very high level. There's a lot of details left out, but I'm going to try and kind of cover a lot of important concepts for you in a short period of time. So I am, for those of you who don't know me, I'm a developer experience engineer at LaunchDarkly. LaunchDarkly is a feature management and experimentation platform. If you haven't heard of it, I'm happy to talk to you more about it later. I will be around, but I'm not going to talk too much about it here. I've talked a lot about Jamstack stuff, which, I kind of feel like I'm going to talk about Jamstack here. And I kind of feel like, if I come to a conference and they're like, okay, the author of the book is up, and then you're going to be up talking about that author's book after they get up and talk, because I'm here talking after Matt, who came up with the term Jamstack, and I'm going to talk about it too. So it kind of feels a little bit like I'm under this. Thankfully, he's not here. He's off taking a call, so he's not going to get to critique my version of Jamstack. So before I talk about that stuff, I want to talk a little bit about just jargon and buzzwords in general, because developers, we tend to complain a lot about like jargon, and we tend to say like, oh, that's just a buzzword. But the thing is, jargon can be very useful because it takes a complex thing and simplifies it down to like a short term that we can use, so that we don't have to give this long explanation every time. So it's important shorthand. In fact, like it's not like just us developers who have jargon and like buzzwords. Like if you think, I was reading recently that like surfers have 20 different types of waves. So like those of us who don't surf will just look and we'll be like, oh, that's just a wave. But to a surfer, there's all kinds of terminology around like how you would describe a wave. Or if you're a carpenter, there's like dozens of types of nails that the rest of us are just like, go to the hardware store, I need a nail, right? But they know how to accurately describe exactly the kind of nail that they need. And so we've created all these kind of buzzwords and jargon to describe these things so that we don't have to kind of explain the concept every time we bring it up. But we also, there's good reasons why developers don't like jargon. First of all, it can be exclusionary. So part of the problem with jargon is that if you don't know, well, you don't know. So like I could be here talking about a topic and using lots of terminology or writing about it and kind of assuming that you already know. And then the people who don't feel left out may not feel like they can ask the question because, well, it seems like everybody around me already knows what that term means, so I'm not going to be the one who looks like an idiot and says, hey, I don't even know what that acronym you're using means, right? So that's problem number one. Number two, jargon and buzzwords can get ambiguous. So over time, as technologies mature, sometimes they tend to kind of add a lot of things, and so that buzzword that may have initially described something very concrete and discrete starts getting a little fuzzier and harder to explain. So people start saying like, oh, I don't even know what that means anymore, kind of thing. And then jargon can be appropriated. So this is where like often developers get complained. They're like, oh, that's just a marketing term, right? And part of that is like, well, maybe it did describe something legit, but then as more people adopted it, companies are going to obviously kind of latch on to that and be like, oh, hey, we're going to use that term that everybody's using in our marketing materials. And so suddenly it starts to feel like, hey, this is now just a marketing term. This is not an accurate useful buzzword. So I also, like when I was doing a lot of research about this, there's a site called the Jargon File. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's been around like forever. And it kind of gets a little bit deeper into describing like terms of jargon. They actually differentiate between jargon and tech speak. So they say jargon is kind of informal terms that we use to describe things, whereas tech speak is more formalized terms. But of course, as is kind of you might expect, what's the difference between jargon and tech speak? Well, that's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Like there's not a clear distinction between the two. So I am been a JavaScript and front-end developer for a long time, and we do have quite a lot of buzzwords. I tried. This is my best trying to kind of lay out a bunch of them. I initially was hoping to actually cover them all, but I'm not really going to get to those ones. So if those were the ones you were really, really excited about, sorry. But I'm going to get to everything else that's there, because there's a lot of them. And I mean, I know you're probably thinking like, what about this other buzzword that I'm hearing all the time that's not even listed there? You're right. I just, there's a lot. We come up with a new one every day. So Matt covered a little bit of this ground earlier, but I'm going to kind of start with the term Jamstack. But in order to discuss the term Jamstack, and of course Matt created the term, but in order to discuss the term Jamstack, I'm going to go back to a little bit of my history with this, okay? I started with building sites using static site generators in 2008. Funny enough, this is how I met Matt many, many years ago before Netlify was launched. As I was out there talking about static site generators, and I had, actually this is some of the stuff like that chart or diagram is something that I used in some of my initial presentations about it, and this was back in like 2010 or so. And it was pretty simple, the concept, right? I mean, static site generators would take a bunch of assets and pre-render them and generate out static files that you can then deploy, right? The problem with that is that when you describe something as static, well, it sounds old. And it's like, well, I remember I was talking about it all the time, and I was going to speak at events and things like that, and people were like, yeah, but what can I actually build with a static site generator, right? Like, my site isn't static. My site has interactive things. My site has, all this going on. There's no way I could possibly use a static site generator. It seems like just a tool for blogs. So around that time, Matt and his co-founder Chris Bach were building a Netlify, and they were trying to get developers to kind of buy into this concept that Netlify was selling. And obviously, static sites was not exactly the greatest way to market it, so because companies didn't really buy into the idea of static sites, and developers didn't either, for that matter. We tended to, they thought it was a niche tool, niche technology. And so Matt and Chris came up with this term, Jamstack, in around 2015. And as he discussed earlier, if you were here for his presentation, he presented it at the Smashing conference, and then they had a site this is actually from the original site that described Jamstack back then, that they launched at the time. And so the idea was basically, you were talking about sites that were still more or less static sites. So, but it kind of laid out this idea of the JAM being, the JAM was JavaScript, APIs, and markup, okay? So the thing to think about is that at the time there was other concepts of like LAMP stack was very popular, and that's a very prescriptive stack. Jamstack, JavaScript, APIs, and markup, as you can think, well, my site uses JavaScript, APIs, and markup, even though I'm writing in PHP. Is that Jamstack? No. So it's not a very prescriptive stack in that sense. It was more a conceptual stack. And so a lot of people I think that the term did actually work very well. It gained a lot of popularity. But essentially, it was describing what we were already doing in some senses. We were doing static site generators with some sprinkling of JavaScript on the client side that basically enabled you to add in some dynamic stuff, maybe even call some external APIs. But other than that, like, it was largely static. And I think in some senses what they were describing was more a kind of long-term vision for what might be. Matt, as you heard earlier, he talked a lot about decoupling. And like, so we were sort of decoupling, but we weren't really decoupling. I mean, he and I were actually talking about this up in the speaker room, because I'm like, yeah, but when the term came out, Gatsby was like literally just released that same year. We were mostly using tools like Hugo and Jekyll to do static sites and then sprinkling them with JavaScript. The idea of what it became happened kind of later and built on the term. So the good news is that term was actually really successful. It worked, right? Netlify became popular. Other services came out. You had Vercel, and even, you know, Microsoft started releasing similar types of tools. Cloudflare now has it. I mean, there's all kinds of tools that, you know, Netlify kind of created this space, but there's been a lot that jumped on. And part of that was the popularity of this term Jamstack, because it was able to get beyond just the niche of people who would use static sites. So around 2022, they decided, well, okay, things had changed. We're now using serverless functions, and we're using, you know, we're doing more than just deploying static sites. A lot of this, maybe we've added in server-side rendering and all kinds of other stuff. And so things got a lot more complicated. So in order to kind of accommodate that under this Jamstack term, they redefined it. And if, you may have noticed that, like, the JAM was no longer capitalized, because it was not all about JavaScript APIs and markup. There was actually so much confusion at the time of, like, about it, because the JAM, like, people would ask about it, and it became like JavaScript was JavaScript framework, and it really wasn't intended to be a JavaScript framework only thing. And the M, everybody thought it was Markdown, and it's actually, you know, so I think losing the acronym made sense. But we also broadened the definition. So this is kind of like that evolving of terminology that we talked about, of jargon, where it tends to kind of expand to meet, you know, all the things that get added on. And so at this point, it became what felt like it was much more vague. But I still think of it like it really ended up being more like the full stack JavaScript framework. So things like Next.js and Nuxt, with a platform, something like Vercel or Netlify. Obviously there's a ton of others, right, to support things like serverless functions and all kinds of other back-end functionality that went along with that. So I kind of looked at it as Jamstack as like a umbrella term, and then we had all these other terms that kind of fell underneath it. At this point, Jamstack is kind of broad and diffuse, but we have a lot of other more specific jargon that described all the techniques and everything that fell under this umbrella. So one of the things Matt talked about as well is this idea of decoupling, right? And so to me, like, decoupling is one of those things that's hard to explain. I think Matt tried to explain it. To me, it's easier to understand it when you think of the alternative, because then you can understand what it is describing. So we were trying to create an alternative to this monolithic architecture. So if you've built sites like using something, WordPress is kind of the canonical example of a monolithic architecture, particularly back in the day when everything, like, in order to make a change on the back end, that would require me to change things on the front end, because everything was so tightly tied together. I could not actually update the back end without updating the front end, because it was all one big piece, right? So we were trying to then say, okay, could we decouple that so that the back end now is completely separate? Because if you think about it, we were not just trying to support web applications, we were trying to support mobile applications or voice applications or other types of applications. And so people were like, well, I don't want to have to maintain, you know, one set of content here for like my web application, but then I'm repeating that same thing for my mobile application. in a different system because they can't speak to each other. So this kind of decoupled architecture allowed us to be a little bit more flexible in how we built things, but also support multiple different front ends with the same back end, which leads you to this other term that you hear thrown around a lot, which is headless. And so essentially the idea of headless was again, but at the time, monolithic CMSs were the big thing. You had the CMS like a Drupal, which did the front end and the back end, and there was no way to kind of decouple those two pieces. So companies like Contentful and others kind of came up with this idea of maybe we just need the back end of the content management system and allow you can connect whatever front end you want to it, right? So that also led to the things like headless commerce, which is essentially the back end of an e-commerce system without with not a tie to the front end. So I can slap whatever front end I want onto that back end, and thus that's why we call it headless. So another term you'll hear thrown around is this idea of pre-rendering. And so the pre-rendering is just, honestly, it's just a fancy word for saying something is static, right? So pre-rendered is static, but there is, I will admit, there is, and I'm going to explain why, a legitimate reason why using this more complicated version of saying pre-rendering as opposed to static is a better thing. And that's because when you get into types of renderings, things get a little complicated. So these are kind of acronyms you'll see thrown around a lot with various frameworks and so on and so forth. They're often not explained very well. So CSR is for client-side rendering. So client-side rendering, think of it like more like your traditional single-page application, to use another kind of piece of jargon, or SPA, right? So your single-page application was basically rendering everything in JavaScript on the client in the browser. So we would then we would hydrate it, again, another jargon. We would hydrate the application with new content by calling, basically getting data from the content data from the API, the backend API, and then hydrating that on the client. But all that rendering portion was done on the client, right? So then server-side rendering, in this case, instead of hydrating the client with all that being done on the client, we're now, every request, we're sending that over, and we're actually re-rendering the page on the server and sending it over. I kind of joke that server-side rendering is what I've been doing. I mean, I started building websites 25 plus years ago. We were doing server-side rendering, but if you talk to developers now, you think it was invented 2 years ago by React, because this has actually been something we're moving a lot from client-side rendering towards server-side rendering, because the performance of client-side rendering, particularly on devices and things like that, the bundle sizes and all this other stuff caused a lot of problems. So now you'll notice frameworks, even React, starting to move towards server-side rendering with things like React Server Components and so on, and lots of newer frameworks that are focused solely on server-side rendering. And then SSG is static site generation. So this goes back to that pre-rendering idea. And the reason I like to think of it as pre-rendering is because static site generation makes it sound like it's different from server-side rendering in a way that's not as distinct as you might think. Basically, static site generation is I'm server-side rendering, but I'm server-side rendering it at build time and then pushing it out. And the reason I think that's important to think about is because sometimes when you're actually dealing with how something's going to get rendered, you think this is completely different, when actually, if I switch that to server-side rendered or static, it's just when it happens is the only difference. Ultimately, it functions the same. So then, to throw a whole boatload of acronyms at you, because we love acronyms. So there's things like CSR, we're talking about, this is ISR, DPR, DSG, which were all things that around at the same time that were trying to describe the same basic thing. They just had slightly different implementations. I just like to call this deferred rendering. Basically, the idea here is like, think of if static site generator and the server-side rendering had a baby, this would be this. So basically, it's like on the first call to a page, I will render it on the server, cache that as static. So basically, in some cases, it's even added as a static asset to the actual output of the site, but it's only done on demand. So that's why I kind of call it deferred rendering, because it's like we're static site rendering. We're basically static rendering a page, but doing it on the first request, and then serving everybody else who comes after that the static version. This allows you to kind of cut down on your build time while also getting the benefits of static site generation, which will be fast and everything else, right? So, okay, we're finally getting to the term composable. And so what I'll say really quickly when I describe composable is a lot of people thought, well, this is just like companies like Netlify or whatever making an enterprisey version of Jamstack. Like they're giving up on Jamstack term and they're just going to remarket it as composable. And the thing is, that's not how it really is. Composability is really much more focused on the backend. In fact, when you talk about like it's not even concerned with what kind of application you're building on the front end, right? So you could be using you could have a composable architecture that talks to a mobile application. You could have it that talks to a web application. Jamstack was very focused on how you build your site, and it's all about websites and things like that. Composability is not about that. Composability is just really about, we started having a problem, and some of you, particularly if you work at big companies, may have this problem, where we're pulling data from all over the place, right? So I think of a commerce site as a good example of this, because it's the most common example used when you talk about composability is I'll have a payments API and an API that gets my customer data, an API that gets my product data, and then I have to check the inventory data and so on and so forth. And the problem that developers were having is like, okay, I have all these different APIs. Now I need to create this whole kind of back end for front end pattern where I might have a layer on the front end that's just trying to weave together all my back end APIs and then I'm like doing complex things like, okay, well, now I get the customer data from the customer API to get the customer ID to then pass it to the orders API to get the orders, and you're weaving together all this complex stuff, often coming from different systems and different APIs, and it was hard to pull all that together. So these platforms tend to provide a way to kind of tie all those pieces together and make it really easy to kind of drop those pieces in. In some cases, they'll even have like connectivity to common systems like Storyblock, who's out there, for instance, and you just drag that in and it works. Typically, all the ones I've seen tend to use GraphQL because it's really kind of the most common way to kind of tie together multiple APIs into a single kind of reusable API. So, like Netlify's does, but there's also kinds of many other tools that do similar things, and they tend to use GraphQL for that. So this could be using third-party APIs, internal APIs, and so on, all kind of combined into a single consolidated view. And GraphQL is actually really good for that. So I think the key here, though, to think about is that, does that mean like you could do Composable or Jamstack? No, you can do Composable and Jamstack together. They're not mutually exclusive. Your Composable backend could connect to a Jamstack web application. They work together. And it's not necessarily just, I think when people complain about that term being too enterprisey, it's because that problem is an enterprise level problem. It's not a problem that you and I, as like maybe making a hobby application or a side project, are going to run into where we're pulling data from so many different sources that we have to deal with that complexity. So it is an enterprisey solution, but it's not necessarily a different way to market Jamstack. I just want to kind of quickly, because I'm running out of time, go over like one last term, because if you read about composability, you often see this term mock thrown in, which is like microservices, APIs, microservices, APIs, cloud native, SaaS, and headless. So this is like, if you think of composability, like fits into this, right? It's a core tenet of mock, but you'll often see this mock term thrown around. There's actually a group, a not-for-profit industry group called the Mock Alliance that talks about this. It's a slightly more prescriptive version of this composability. I only bring it up because when you read about composability, you'll often come across this, and it's not necessarily something most folks have heard of or understand, I think. At least, you know, I hadn't. Okay, so it wasn't actually 30 seconds, it was about 25 minutes, but I threw a lot of terms at you and a lot of explanations. I hope it's actually been helpful, but I am always happy to answer questions. I will be here for the rest of the evening, and if you go to the party tonight, I will, or whatever's going on tonight, I will be there. You can reach me on Mastodon and on Threads or on email. I'm happy to talk to you at any point afterwards. I'm not on the bad place anymore, so sorry. Yeah, that's it for me. And I don't know, do we have time for any questions, or we're out of time, aren't we? Yeah.
I've been honoring folks' session length, so if you want to take one question, we have time for one question.
If anybody has any questions, I'm happy. Yeah. I explained it so perfectly, so I don't know. Success!
I am left with many deep thoughts and questions, but I will leave mine.
Well, thank you.